Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're listening to Newcastle Fast FM. Welcome back, viewers, listeners, and welcome back our special guest, Dr. Abdul Haqq. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome back, and we're looking for a wonderful conversation again today, hopefully enlightening, thought-provoking, and challenging, inshallah. And as we always say to our dear guests and viewers who are joining us, inshallah, from across the world, mashallah, is please like, subscribe, share as much as you can. And of course, what we mean by sharing is get involved with the chat. Get involved with the discussion, drop your thoughts and ideas, and inshallah, we'll try and bring you in as much as we can and discuss as much as we can within the topic matter of this show. If it does go a little bit out, let's just see how it fits in, and we'll go with that, inshallah. And again, the views are ours, myself as a presenter, and our special guest here, Dr. Abdul Haqq. And it's been an interesting week again. Last week, we had a wonderful discussion around friendship. And we were looking at the value of friends and the purpose of friends in that sense of how they can benefit us, they can aid us, and they can allow us to find ourselves, our true selves in that way, and the benefit and the beauty of that, inshallah.
Absolutely. And I think that previous to that, we looked at the type of companions that are good to align ourselves with, and those that we need to be cautious and aware of, even though we may be attracted to some of them due to it being cool or being in vogue, and liking that part of our soul that inclines to mischief. So yes, all of that. And I think all of this is necessary, Wajid, because we're talking in a context. We're always talking in an environment. And when we're speaking to each other about behavioral trends, and we're speaking to our children about behavioral trends, it's not in a vacuum. It's not within a vacuum. And I still think that if we look at everything today with what's going on in the world with the pandemic, and we're looking at the challenges and the not only the challenges, the positives that come out of this, it's all to do with social interaction. If you look at the industry that is very adversely affected and what everyone is longing for, you've got wider non-Muslim society wanting to socialize, go to the pub, fraternize. That's everyone across the board, even the Muslims. Everyone wants to get back out in Saudi to the Corniche, to restaurants. It's all about socialization. It's all about interaction. And so I think that these lectures that we've been listening to, these shows and discussions that we've been having about personality types, about identity and everything like this, it's a really good and I think timely discussion to have, so that when things do eventually reopen fully, which they will do again, let's hope that our social skills, our social interaction skills are better, because we've reviewed many things that we took for granted. Let's hope that our viewers and others will take some benefit from looking and listening to the various avenues and angles that we've been discussing things from all around identity, who we are, where we are, good companionship, bad companionship, ethnicity, race. All of this is within an environment of us interacting, because we are of that type. We need each other.
And I think it lends itself, like you said, from the discussions we've had across our time together, alhamdulillah, is that, like last week we looked at ideal character. That was something that was sort of prominent in our discussion. And one of those things that we looked at was something that was bigger within ourselves, but we also looked at in the sense of understanding, the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as our creator and our sustainer. That, in the scheme of things, this planet is so small, in the size of things, and where we live is microscopic compared to the vastness of the universe. And within our lives that we have, even in this interaction, there is that element of leadership that is there. And sort of like you said, sometimes you crave certain things that, that fruit over there looks kind of sweet, or that fruit there looks kind of sweet. And we don't have that internal compass that helps us or guides us in a way, inshallah, that gives us that, moving from knowledge into kind of adulthood of sort of knowledge and moving into a state of wisdom. that we don't have that leadership. But again,
Yes.
it comes from this human interaction, like you said. You know, we can have an opinion. I can have an opinion today, and from our discussion, you know, we can have something. And I just want to quickly say, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to our dear sister Salwa, who's joined us again, mashallah. I believe she's joined us from America, mashallah. So,
Yes.
and so thank you again for joining us again, sister. Jazakallah khair. And again, that interaction that we're just talking about, you know, sister is engaging with this discussion, and has been, mashallah. But it requires that kind of human interaction, because it feels so void, doesn't it? And I think that's one of the things that we've had as a challenge, that we kind of feel out of place, but because we've kind of got used to a certain way of living, and that's suddenly been turned on its head in the way that we can interact. It's asked a lot of questions of us, and some of those questions are very uncomfortable, even before we get into the ethics and the politics that we've sort of begun our initial discussions from.
No, absolutely. And I think that what you're saying speaks to us as an older generation, not too old, alhamdulillah, but an older generation. Whereas with the younger generation, they are so attached to this forum now with social media, but yet they're not taking the opportunity to interact via the technology, seeing each other, speaking to each other. It's all about typing in Facebook short messages, emojis. The communicative aspect for them has become very, very restricted. Good to see you as well, Salwa. Jazakallah khair. Alhamdulillah. And Seattle, beautiful place, mashallah, tabarakallah. I'm yet to visit, but I've heard a lot about it, alhamdulillah. And even, again, coming back to that communicative avenue, Sister Salwa came in with Salaam alaikum rahmatullah. And for those non-Muslim viewers who are watching this now, this is the greeting for us that we love and are familiar with, meaning peace be upon you, and if wa rahmatullah, and the mercy of Allah, wa barakatuh, and the blessings of Allah. And this is a greeting that will accompany us in this life, and inshallah we get to paradise. That will be the greetings of salam. Again, communication. When we speak from a non-Muslim vernacular, when I used to be a non-Muslim, we would greet each other fondly. We had our street slang and lingo and language there. But if it was formal, there'd be a hello, there'd be hi, there'd be that formality. And these are things that we take for granted. Now, you live up north in a smaller environment, a city than I do. In London, we never greet the person that we see in the street. And what I used to like when I used to go out to West Country, to Cornwall, to see my friends in Perranporth and places like that, family friends, is you could be walking down a country lane, and even as Muslims, my wife was wearing niqab, and they'd say, hi, how are you? How are you doing? Is everything okay? They're welcoming. So this social interaction is so important, and we need to seize upon the opportunity now as we're about to go into belonging, identity, nationhood. It starts from that very rudimentary, basic aspect between two people, and then a family, and then families, and then a village, and then like this.
And it expands. And I think just to expand on that a little bit, what you've just said, Abdul Haqq, you see, because when we say salam and we interact in that way, and wa alaikum assalam, Naheem, for joining us as well, jazakallah khair. When we say salam, it means peace. Understand? Yes. So it's kind of like you're making a small prayer for the individual that you interact with. Right. You begin with that straight foundation, you know, when you say assalamu alaikum, and it comes from that sincere place in the heart, it means something beautiful. And it's like you said, it's about those concentric circles that then emanate out from our interactions. But in the first sense, it's about grounding ourselves and sort of saying this is where it's beginning.
And that's absolutely. And if we move it to a wider context, I want to bring two things that will open it up now. And when we look at the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the two angels came to him, and he greeted them with salam, and look at his hospitality. Immediately he brought the roasted calf for them to eat, and their hands went not near it. They didn't go to eat of it. And then he perceived the fear. He became fearful of them. And they told him, "Qalu la takhaf," that do not be afraid. This is who we are. that's an indication that these were people unknown, okay? But yet there was that welcoming aspect, that greeting aspect from Ibrahim. I'll open it wider, as I say now. Let's look at this in the societal context, the geographic context now, when Western Europeans first landed on the shores of indigenous people in America and in Africa. You saw the same opening up and greeting from a nation to visitors. But there wasn't that intention of salam. And this is where we see now, from that time until where we are now, the element of difference, that element of nationhood, that element of other. That's where we have gone full circle from those times to where we are right now. And that brings us up to popularism, which is taking hold now in the UK with Brexit, what's going across the UK, what's happening with America, with Trump and white nationalism and supremacy, and even from the element of privilege, who are privileged, who aren't privileged. And it can become a very divisive discussion. And I think that now we're going to look at what does nationhood, what does a sense of belonging mean? And I want to refer in this first instance to lay that platform with what Imam Shafi'i said. And he said, it is not racism that a person loves his people. Rather, racism is to despise others simply because they belong to a different race. Rather, racism is to despise others simply because they belong to a different race. Yeah. And I think in that context, if we can start discussing, and yes, it's been put up on the screen there for the viewers. So if we can start looking at moving from now the individual and the company that they keep and the good and bad company, and look at what does nationalism entail, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What is permissible for us to hold on to from nationalism, and what is impermissible from nationalism? And we have to look at, I think we have to look only through the prism of what Islam says in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, if we can just, I think it's called roots of nationalism, and I think if we explore where the roots come from, in the sense of that there would have been areas where there were tribes, where there were small communities, whether they had chiefs or kings or, you know, viceroys or whatever kind of rulers or heads of communities and societies were. These things would have existed, but ultimately societies thrive on this kind of, like you said, of getting to know each other, but also this kind of what we would call economic prosperity. It's kind of a required thing to do. And I think you're right in the sense that you know, when we were at uni, we used to have we used to tease each other. So like if you know, if you came to see me and you were just passing by, I said, oh, Wajid, I just need a and you'd carry on. And then afterwards, you know, you'd be like, oh, did you go see Wajid? He goes, yeah, man. You didn't even offer me tea. You know, it's like a thing you would say to put me down, you know, like a jibe, you know, like, yeah, you didn't offer me tea. What are you chatting about? You only came for a minute. Yeah, but you didn't even offer me tea. You know, it's almost like you know, like looking down on somebody. How dare you not even have this minimum amount of hospitality of offering tea? You know, that's your core fundamental. You know, come in, have tea. You know, you gotta have tea. You know, you gotta have some biscuits before you go. That was kind of, you know, that's your minimum process, and that's within our culture. You know, and
we know from the time of the Prophet, it used to be water and dates. If you could even offer to your guests dates and water.
Yeah,
you know. So
what you had was on the table. What you had was on the table, and
exactly.
Subhanallah, there's this story, you know. When the first time I was blessed to do Umrah, I was in '98, and we met somebody who was from our area in Kashmir, and he, you know, and we were talking about this kind of bond and tribalism. So this man was running this hotel, and in those days you got a visa, you went over, but you didn't need the rest of the bookings. You just kind of found your way to a place, but we got told, because my cousins were there, they said, look, there's this hotel, it's kind of run by somebody from our area. So you go there, and this guy gets to know us, and he comes to see us in the evenings after we prayed our Isha, and he just sits, chats, you know, he brings a few refreshments, as you do. and you have these conversations. And he told us this, such a powerful conversation. I mean, he was an elderly gentleman in the sense that he was in his 50s at that time when I was in my 20s. And he said, when we were young, we had some people coming, travelers, and they stopped by our house and they said, "Oh, can you look after us? Can you give us a place to rest for the night, because we haven't reached where we want to be, and we kind of like this and kind of like that." So they kind of got a bit of a background check, who you are, where you're from, said, "Okay, we'll give you a place to sleep, and then in the morning." And then because it was evening, they said, "Have you eaten?" And they said, "No, we haven't eaten." So, we'll make you some food. So at that time, there was a lot of poverty in that area, and they said, we don't want to put you out. They said, no, you won't be putting us out. And so what happened was they said that we served them the food, and he was a kid at the time. He said we served them the food, and then we went behind a sheet and we sat there in front of the pots and the pans, and we knocked them about a bit, but we weren't eating anything. We had no food. But we didn't want our guests, our visitors, to think we didn't have food to feed them, or that they wouldn't eat as much, because they were, and their worry was, what if this doesn't fill them and they need more? And so, subhanallah, and he said, alhamdulillah.
That's the same narration at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. There was a family that went exactly through that, because it was dark as well, and they gave their food to the guests, and they mimicked that they were eating, because for the same reason. And this is from the heights of a height of hospitality to your guests, that you would suffer in order to see them through. And again, this comes from particular traditions and cultures of people who are renowned for their nations, or their customs, or their cultures are renowned for this type of hospitality. And I think it's a good perspective to put us from when we're from the start with. If we're looking at what a definition of identity is, and when we're looking at collectives, and I've got here from an article that I will share later on, an expressed sense of personal distinctiveness, personal continuity, and personal autonomy. This is one of the existing definitions of identities from how communities come together. Another definition is sharing of some kind of the individual's essential character with others. And when you look at a wider, like British identity today, is more of a dynamic mosaic, which we should celebrate. It's not as restricted as the two definitions I've just given now. And it's looked upon as an implosion of cultural differences, where the collision of cultures does not cause further divisions, but scattered fragments inwards into the body of colliding cultures. That's the multiculturalism that the UK has become synonymous with. But as you know, there are questions about the death of multiculturalism. That's been taking place for a number of years now, and more so with the splits that have taken place with Brexit. But we're talking about the UK and nationalism, and in that instance. But there are other cultures that hold on to their cultural roots in the UK, when we looked at these identity constructs last week. So, for example, the hybrid identity, where there's that duality of identity, and you see that one, for example, supports Pakistan, or like some will be supporting the West Indies against England now that they're playing cricket at a particular moment in time. And if England were playing Pakistan, then those West Indians will then support England, because it's no longer a country where they have an affinity or cultural pinning or underpinning, should I say.
Yeah. And again, when you look at different levels of identity, because there are certain identities that step forward, and there are identities that move backwards and forwards depending on what the scenario is. Like you said, I mean, right. We can say that we support England as a football team, let's say, but ultimately what really divides us is what Premier League team we support, or division, League 1 or 2, whatever it is. And that's what really starts the impassioned discussion. And that comes down to that kind of allegiance that gets put on to a particular team, and leads to that kind of narrowness sometimes of thought, you know, like you know,
Absolutely.
as a Geordie, as somebody from Newcastle upon Tyne, you know, every match we lose, we've been robbed, you know, and every match, you know, that we were the best team in the world, we would just happen to be in the wrong way, this way, that way, and everybody's got those excuses and not able to look at things quite subjectively and more subjectively. But there is, I suppose, there's a bit of ego and different things going on, Allahu Alam, but it does give us an idea that we do become impassioned by facets of our identity. And there are certain parts of our identity, I think you mentioned around distinctiveness and continuity, that we can identify for ourselves. But there's also an identity that gets put upon us. You know, as human beings, you know, whether that's the way we brought up in that culture, like, you know, like we were just discussing, you know, the idea of hospitality, what that means, you know, what it means to socially interact, inward, outward, professionally, non-professionally, all of those environments. There is an identity that gets put upon us, and sometimes that's a positive one, and sometimes that's not so positive as well.
That's why it's important, I think, with the previous conversations we've been having, to actually examine and introspect who we are and understand who we are. So, for example, let's explore some of these identity constructs. What does it mean to be British? That's one aspect. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a Muslim? And that should be quite simple for us to hold on to. What does it mean to be culturally connected to our parents' land? And then let's bring all of those together, that multiplicity, and say, who are we? What does it mean to be all of those things under a predominant society that we live in, like the UK? So I'm going to unpack that. What does it mean for you to be British?
I think it's a cultural thing, and it's a mindset thing. You know, especially when you travel, that's when you really get a sense and feeling of Britishness. So, alhamdulillah, I was privileged to to get to do Umrah before the lockdown happened, and just being in a country in that way, you know, and seeing things in a very different way, the way people drive, the way people queue, you know, the way things happen, they're so different. And I think you get that sense of Britishness becomes more, you become more aware and conscious of it. But I suppose living here, it's very much, well, that's just how we do things. Do you know?
And so if we go back to the cognitive models, what you said is very key there, because many of us, and if you check with a lot of Britons, white, black, brown, Muslim, non-Muslim, their sense of identity, research has shown, and it happened with me, the sense of identity of where you are from becomes that much more pronounced when you are in a different societal context. So for me, I became a lot more aware of being British when I came to live in Saudi Arabia. And that wasn't because of adverse experiences. It was because when my accent was heard, the way I dressed, the positions that I was in, that's because you're British. Yeah. That's because you're British. And I had, when I first came over, I remember I was in a particular area. This was in 97 when I first ever came, before I came back to the UK and came out again. And there was a call booth. And I came out of a call booth, and this white individual came up to me and he said, English. I realized he was British. And he said, "You're from London?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, I know exactly where you are from South London by your accent. And I'm going to tell you within a mile or two. And I was like, "Yeah, sure." He says, you're from the Crystal Palace region. And I was like, "Yeah, I'm from Tooting, which is like a mile and a half from Crystal Palace." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "I know accents." And many people can discern. Us from South London, we're very proud. We hold that London is really South London, just extended. But we hold that the South London accent has a various intonations and twangs to it. But coming abroad, and even some colleagues who came out for Umrah like you did, became much more aware of their sense of Britishness. And the point I want to make here, if we go back to my cognitive development framework, is your understanding of your identity becomes more actualized when you go out of your country and you return to it. Whereas, as you said, when you're in the UK, you haven't traveled, you haven't interacted or been abroad very much, and you take it for granted. It's abstract. It's like, okay, I'm British. When you ask people, what does British mean? Fish and chips and supporting England. Yes, it means all of those things. But that's abstract. When you travel, you realize what it means to be British because of your interaction with others, because of standards or etiquettes that you are used to in the UK. And when it's absent amongst the different and other people, for example, like we love to queue in the UK. So I get incensed when I see people not queuing. And I look at them and say, no, we queue. And they're looking at me like, who is this guy? He's from the UK or from, we're used to that. For them, it's nice, a cultural all in. It's got better, obviously, now. But so by being out of your environment, you become more aware of who you are and your identity.
And it's interesting because, you know, when you look at kind of, especially the writers and the explorers of sort of the 18th, 19th century, they talk about that, you know, that travel broadens the mind.
Yes.
And it is from that, because like you said, that there's a very interesting word used about actualization, being actualized. And you get that self-actualization by becoming more self-aware, but you become self-aware because you're in that different environment. Like you said, you might be in an environment where you feel uncomfortable. It's not that anything's going wrong or bad in that environment, but it's just different to what you're used to. So your modus operandi, you know, this idea of how you're supposed to do things has been shifted to 45 degrees and it's completely facing a different direction now, and your mind's just like, so this sense of uncomfortability, you know, you're starting to experience that. And travel was those things. And I think in those days, I think that's why people read so much, because travel was so expensive.
Yes.
But you could experience some of that travel by broadening your mind through that knowledge and education. And there was a fervor in that sense, especially amongst certain communities, to just read as much as you could. You know, people go off and tell tales, and fantastical tales.
Yes.
Dragons and this and that and all of these wonderful things.
Yeah, not always so wonderful, because as you know,
yes, of course,
stereotype came upon Africa, where people were dehumanized and slanderous and fantastical tales were told, and that it had to be a land and a people who were conquered. And some of those books and literature are still there to this day.
Well, so just going back to the idea of, you're right, you know, that there's a spectrum of those things, but some of the images that you'll see of how, you know, African people or people from Asia were depicted, you know, it really is something like like it's not human, you know, and to think that somebody could go away and pitch that and get a whole bunch of funding to go ahead and do something is just kind of mind-blowing.
And that's where we've talked about traveling abroad and getting our sense of identity. And then we go back to Imam Shafi's statement there about loving your people. That the problem comes when you start looking at the people that you are amongst, if you've traveled, with disdain. When you start looking down upon the people that you are living amongst in that foreign land, for example, that's when it becomes problematical. That's when you start seeing these fissures start taking place, and division and tension and racism starts raising its head in that particular instance. And it can be reversed. You can be that minority in that land, as happens with many of us who are expats, and there may be a national cry or a national issue, or there may be economic woes that are taking place, like we've seen, like in South Africa, they started turning on other African expats who were living in South Africa. We're witnessing that. We've seen it through the decades in the UK. When there's socio-economic deprivation and problems, we see them turn on. It's the immigrants. The immigrants are taking our jobs. They never considered for one moment when those jobs were available, they never wanted them because they saw them as menial and beneath them. But a target is chosen, and it's often a minority, and they're made into that other. And the worrying thing there is, for example, having that sense of identity when you've traveled abroad, yourself, myself, and then we return to the UK, proud of being British, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, because of what it has afforded us and what our parents have been able to carve out for us and the benefits there. But then when you become that target of racism, it causes a dissonance in your mind that, well, hold on a minute, this is my country. This is where I'm from. This is the land of my birth. And I've got this sense of Britishness and I've actualized it through my travels. Yet when I come home and there's an issue, we are othered and targeted. And for individuals who don't have a backdrop or a home of origin to call their own, in that instance, familiar with it. Like, for example, I'm mixed culturally. My father was from Nigeria. My mother's from South America, Guyana. So I don't have that one place of origin that I familiarize myself with. I'm familiar with neither. I'm familiar with
two different continents, and you're on the third one itself. You're in a completely different one.
I'm familiar with the UK. So I'll give you an example. Recently, a post in Facebook concerning the cricketer, what's his name? Clive Holding or Holder, who was emotional.
Mike Holding, Mike Holding. Yeah. Great baller, great batsman.
So, I'm not familiar with cricket, but I know he's a good man. But so some of the postings, others were really, it went viral. People were really making comments on the post and they liked it. And a South Asian individual wrote, if you don't like this country or you don't like white people, go back to Africa. So that opened up a discussion now. It's like, whoa, this is a racist trope. And what you're saying is insulting. And no one's talking in that tone. So some of us went back and forth with this individual, but it was between me and him. And he came back again. I think he got kicked off anyway, and others chastised him. Go back to Africa. And I said, hold on, but where exactly? Okay, I know my dad's from Nigeria, but I said, I'm from here. I'm from here. So if it wasn't for my parents meeting in the UK, I wouldn't exist. Yes. So that's anyway, it's Allah's qadr in that instance. But so when you get that othering from people who are fellow Britons, irrespective of their places of origin, that causes, as I said, I've used that term, that dissonance in the mind that, whoa, hold on a minute. I'm being othered in the place that I come from. Now, that's where I want to move on to that, another construct here. That's where you will see the vulnerability amongst the undetermined identity that we spoke about before. Those individuals that are not so sure about their identity, they may be developing their identity, and they're closer in that quadrant of threats. They don't know how to take advantage of the strengths. There's the threats there. And these individuals, and it's happened, this could become a process of radicalization for individuals when they are being othered in a society that they've been raised in, but they become more religious. They become more religious, and they are exposed to extremist propaganda, because not all Muslims who become religious are under threat in that way. The vast majority aren't. But if an individual has an issue with belonging and who they are, and you have extremist propaganda saying, eschew, get rid of, remove all identities. We just have the identity of the Muslim Ummah. That one construct. That's fine. We are happy with that. But then they start telling you or inculcating in you to hate every other identity, every other cultural, national identity. You are just Muslim. Now, if we look in the annals of history, going right back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that didn't happen. You had Sahaba, and the appellation to their name would be the region that they came from, Ar-Rumi. The scholars, Al-Baghdadi, Al-Bukhari. You know, you had those. So knowing where you were from and attaching that as a suffix to your name, perfectly permissible. But when you strip every element of identity away from that individual and you say just the Ummah, and then you start pointing to the trials that are afflicting other regions where the Ummah is, China with the Uyghurs, Kashmir, the Rohingyas in Burma, Palestine, that inculcates a love for the Ummah that I feel a passion and a zeal, as we should do. If one part of the body's aching, the whole body aches. But it's not put within a discernible context. It becomes an abstract. And those individuals with that undetermined identity, that vulnerability in that identity, they then become more susceptible to radicalization. So identity, belonging, national understanding of identity in the permissible sense are very, very important to understand, to embrace.
I think though, as ethnic minorities, we get challenged a lot more on our allegiances and our nationality than anybody else, you know. And I think one of the things that kind of is like you said, you know, you go abroad, you'll come back, and you kind of get put into like a hierarchy system. You know, there's this kind of like, well, actually, you should be here. Why are you here? Why are you this progressive? Why are you this successful? Right. You know, so these sort of things happen. But just going back to kind of what you're saying around this idea of stripping away. Now, you might be a determined individual. You're very clear and sort of actualized in that way. You're very clear in your identity. But those around you are trying to determine for you how you fit into all of that. You know, when you look at, I suppose the only thing that I would say in the sort of an example sense would be like sports. Yeah. Right. So, for example, in a sport, you have ethnic minorities. For example, Serena Williams. She gets annoyed at the judge, and it's like, oh, it's, you know, this the reason why she's annoyed at the judge is because she's a black woman. Yeah. It's got nothing to do with the fact that there's an injustice being done on the court. Right. So she's a determined individual. You know, I'm going to be another world champion. I'm going to get another world championship. Yeah. That's what she's there to do. She's determined. She's worked hard for it. But then, as soon as she's speaking up, there's an identity that is put upon her that is then deciding, this is who you are, and this is what you do, and this is why you're reacting.
And this happens with black people almost daily on a number of occasions, these microaggressions. So you'll see many successful black women could be more successful, but they choose not to show resistance or to challenge decisions because they're then labeled as the angry black woman. That particular slight is put there. The black man responds and disagrees. Everyone else is being passionate. He might move his hand like I do, and he's aggressive, and he doesn't know how to get on with his colleagues. He has that chip on his shoulder, and that's something that we have lived with and navigate through life every single day. Multiple microaggressions, and the people inflicting that don't even know that they are doing it some of the time. Other times they are, and I'll give an example. The white lady, the case of the white woman, it's happened a few times where she approached a black colleague to touch her hair. Your hair's so beautiful. And the black woman took umbrage with that, rightly so. And what happened? The white woman became defensive and started crying and saying, you're being so aggressive. Like this Amy, or we call them Karens, this lady, Amy, with her dog, and she was the aggressor. But yet she knew, because of her privilege, that microaggression that she did would get her a result with the law enforcement had they come out and responded like they usually do or often do to her plea for distress. Yeah. And so you're right.
Video not being made, basically. Yeah. So
this is an issue that we have to traverse and navigate on so many occasions, and it can culminate to what it has done fatally on many occasions, as we've seen in the US with George Floyd, and subsequent to that, and these lynchings, these bodies being found hanging in trees weeks afterwards. So it's a no-win situation for some minorities in the particular climate that we're talking about, and for generations it's been the black minorities in that instance. And speaking to that, those of us who are from America, whose lineage has been literally cut off, so there's no trace of that lineage, Those mixed culturally like myself, I know my lineage to a lot on the African side, on the South American side, not so much. When you do not have a community that resonates with you from the complete cultural side of things, you can talk about I'm Kashmiri. Immediately that conjures up a whole framework and apparatus, cultural, historical, and everything for you. Those of us who are American, African American, those of us who are in the UK, mixed culturally, and we can't forget the not only mixed culturally, mixed ethnicity, mixed parentage, white and black. What about their identity constructs? So to be other than British is a difficult reality in itself. Because
it kind of raises a question that's quite interesting from what you're saying there, Dr. Abdul Haqq, around being cut off, because I think we kind of get into, you know, fourth, fifth generation of our communities here that are now established, right? But there's no link back. But what effect does that have? You know, I mean, you're talking about stuff that's gone on for centuries. I'm talking just a few generations of sort of migration. But nonetheless, being cut off in that way of that root identity, how important is that?
I think it's very important. I think knowing, having a sense of who you are and where you're from, it's like knowing where the roots of your existence emanated from, where those seeds were planted. And I'll add quickly, the Muslim identity comes to reinforce that and root out the weeds that may have developed with that. So the weeds will be the impermissible nationalism, the impermissible aspects of identity, racism and the like. But it enhances those roots that were already there. Surah Hujurat, verse 13, we made you into tribes and nations that you may know each other. The best of you in conduct is the one with the most taqwa, the most piety. But look at those words, the initial words. We made you into tribes and nations, so that we were made into tribes and nations, that we may know each other. What is a tribe? What is a nation? There's historic, there are historic roots to tribes and nations. So if you don't have that familiar connection and connectivity that you can trace to know who you are, to know a history about your people, then when you're like a ship without an anchor in the middle of an ocean, not seeing any shore and just sailing in pitch blackness, pitch darkness. Whereas if you've got that route, if you're away from it, you know where to go to return. If you're departing from it, you know it's behind you, so you have that security. But if you do not have that, like we see with African Americans, like we see with some of us who don't know or unfamiliar with our parents' lineage or where they emanate from, it causes again, shall I use the word dissonance, or it causes a vacuum, and it can then inculcate in that individual self-destructive tendency. Again, in that vacuum, when they embrace a faith, be it a doomsday cult like Jim Jones, that Christian cult, the guy in the tragedy that happened, Georgetown tragedy that happened many, many years ago, decades ago, Waco, for example, or with the Christians, the Davidians. When we look at the Juhayman al-Utaybi cult, when we look at other cults, when we look at extremism, all of that radicalization took place in a vacuum that already existed in those individuals' psyche and character. And someone came along and propaganda came along and an ideology that was distorted came along and filled that vacuum. So it's important to have that root.
Yeah. So just exploring that a little bit more, because there was a question you asked me so a bit earlier on the show, and that was, how do you define yourself as British? And I think one of the things about being British, there isn't really a definition for it, but I think it moves into that ugly territory when somebody can be vocal about, whether it's about the government, whether it's about services, whether it's politics nationally or internationally, and where somebody defines your Britishness by shutting down your whole argument, however intellectual and valid it is, by saying go back home. Because there are some people who are having that same sort of discussion who are not going to have that said to them. And
Yes.
so by being in a certain skin tone or whatever that might be, you get told go back home. But for somebody else to do it, well, that's their democratic British right to be able to have that discussion, to have that open dialogue. And again, same thing with this idea of freedom of speech, that we know it's restricted to certain people who are entitled to have freedom of speech, who then, and I say this in speech marks, who have, what do they call it? Legitimate concerns. That's what they call it, legitimate concerns.
Right, and that speaks again to what we've been discussing throughout these broadcasts, to the systemic, institutionalized racism upon which this society and Western societies are built. That's exactly what it is, because the society is built and the apparatus have been constructed to facilitate white privilege in all its shapes and forms, no matter what class of society you come from. That's why those voices can speak and say what they like, and why those who are brown or black cannot and are placed into particular compartments. And as I've mentioned in previous discussions, that we have been given avenues and compartments which society has directed us towards, or facilitated or allowed us to traverse. And we've got to, and people talk about breaking the glass ceiling. As I've mentioned before, there isn't a glass ceiling for some of us, black communities particularly. It's a corrugated iron ceiling. And what needs to happen is that the structures, the walls need to be dismantled and the foundation needs to be uprooted, so that that structure collapses, and then we build together, not just white imperialist systemic apparatus that have existed on the backs of slavery, transatlantic slavery, but they are built from the bottom up by all those who belong, Commonwealth and otherwise. Not that those of us are welcomed in to the motherland, as the UK was initially called, but no, that there's a dismantling of particular structures and apparatus. And this may sound alarming to individuals, but this is a discussion that's taking place across the Western world at the moment. It is actually taking place across the Western world at the moment. I would dare say and extend that the African countries, the African continent, needs to do similar, because they picked up post-colonial on their independence upon apparatus that were the same as what we are living within now, colonial apparatus. And they are what they've been doing. Some of these societies have been trying to hark back to colonial eras, but on this occasion with African leaders. No, it needs to predate that particular time, because we see histories and civilizations that were far greater than what we saw post-Enlightenment. And when we look at post-Enlightenment, it was exploitative. And that's how Western society, Europe, mainland Europe, UK, America, have established themselves to where they are now. It's 400-500 years old. And again, we need to rebuild together to avoid what you've described with this, what's good for the goose is not good for the gander. You speak and you're a problem. White Britain speaks, that's their human rights and given rights and freedom of speech to say what they need to say. As we see in France, for example, they've made it mandatory to wear the face mask. But the minister in question spoke only recently, saying, but the niqab, the face veil for the Muslim woman, is still banned. As you've said, it fits into that systemic
Canada as well, Quebec or something. Yeah. And it's interesting because, like you say about choice, then like, you know, migration happens, but not necessarily by choice. You know, we know that the continent of Africa, the continent of Asia, is a very rich and resourceful place. You know, hence the Silk Road, hence the you know, the discovery of the West Indies and all these places came from that economic prosperity that nations were seeking to do. But then it turned into this industrialized process of, well, we can just milk this for as much as we can, get what we need out of it. And so that element of choice around nationalism and national identity shifts. But then when you move into that sort of jingoistic kind of, you know, hey ho, here we go kind of mentality, and we see that process of happening. And like you said, like I was sort of highlighting as well, is that one person says it is treason, one citizen says it's treason, but if another citizen says it's, well, that's a rather articulated point, well done. And the wording could be exactly, and the tone could be exactly the same. And I think what is just jumping out of me, and I just made a note of it, is this, you know, like how you train an elephant to stay rooted, you know? So when you have there's a baby elephant, they tie its foot with a small bit of rope onto a peg in the ground. And so when the elephant, with it being a baby, it struggles. It doesn't like being tied up. It naturally, it's an animal, domesticated in some ways, but it wants to go and roam. And it can't. So it pulls on this rope, it pulls on this rope, and it doesn't. So eventually it learns that it's a futile effort to pull on the rope. So even when it grows into a full-size elephant, a small rope tied around its foot will signal to it, it's a futile effort to pull on this thing. You might as well not bother. Whereas if it did, obviously the peg would come flying out the ground, and it's a free animal to roam. But from that early age, it's conditioned in order for it to remain submissive to its master. Obviously, I'm using an animal there as an example. But in the similar sort of way, as a society, and I suppose this is what kind of we were discussing a bit earlier, is that certain elements from society get dictated to us in order for there to remain a civilized society. But then there are certain things that go beyond that don't need to be there, like you mentioned about those structures. Because when you do pull those structures apart, it needs to be done in a way where, like you said, it has to be done in partnership. It has to be done in an allied way. It has to be done in a way where it's conducive and progressive, but in a way where it doesn't lead to complete anarchy.
And that, I'm glad. I think as we move towards the end of the show, this is a very key point that you've mentioned. And we have the best example in structural change, in seismic societal change that didn't cause that, what we've seen in many societies, bloodshed, upheaval, violence. And we can look no further than the prophetic model and what took place. And we watched over a period of decades, of years, just over a decade, was the ideological aspect, the theological foundations of a society were challenged. This was not the tangible structures that we are talking about now, the apparatus that are in place now, that have been put in place. So that needs examples, ambassadors, discussion. And then, as we saw at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, individuals started embracing the religion in droves. And even though the main Meccan society at the time did not come until later, we saw the region hearing the message and embracing Islam, to the extent that the Meccan society was isolated in the region, realizing that at some point their infrastructure, which had started falling apart because of defections, will take place in itself. And I don't know if that's going to be the way it happens in anywhere else in the world. We have a faith in that Islam is going to prevail and spread. We don't have that evangelical ISIS riveted doomsday apocalyptic sort of takeover of nations and everything like that, because that's not how Islam spread. Ideally, it was through good conduct, preaching, and the message being realized by nations like we saw Indonesia become a populous Muslim country and nation. And I think that we will return to that. But our duty with regards to being placed into box or having that metaphorical string tied to our legs to condition us from the beginning, those can be broken and removed if we adhere to what our religion, our deen dictates and asks us to subscribe to. And I think that that's the only way that we can move forward. That is the ultimate revolutionary model, which is an intangible, internal, spiritual, physical one. And then from there, we will see the winds of change come about, so we can enact whatever administrative, managerial, physical change needs to come through peaceably, inshallah.
Inshallah, subhanallah. It's yeah, still a lot to unpick there, but definitely, yeah. I think in that sense of that conditioning process, and I think what's fundamental then is for us to ensure that we recognize those weak ropes. And I think we discussed this when we looked at, when you mentioned and talked about the idols we have in our own hearts.
Yes.
And we discussed that, and we talked about that. We have these structures within ourselves, and I think in the first instance, it's removing, like you mentioned, that corrugated iron ceiling that's there. It's been gilded to make it look nice, but it's a solid block of concrete with iron ore and everything, and it's been made to look like that, so it looks attractive. But in fact, we've kind of got these own impositions on our own mind, and we've kind of got to unravel those. Really, we've got to erode those in a way where, going back to what I said earlier, in the sense that there's not anarchy in your mind, but it's done in a way where actually, the tearing down of this structure, because ultimately it leaves a vacuum, like you've mentioned. Nature abhors a vacuum, as the saying goes. Right. So when you remove something, it leaves a gap, a space, and it's going to get filled with something. That's just natural.
And before you carry on, sorry,
go for it.
And as you said previously as well, last week, that Allah does not change the condition of a people until they've changed what's in their own selves. Now, the original essence of that verse is that changing from prosperity to adversity, but it's been used the other way around as well. That if we want to see change effected societally, if we want to see racism, microaggressions, systemic racism, institutionalized racism removed, when we look at a microcosmic level, we are in fact enacting that on minorities amongst us in various shapes and forms. And instead of looking at the bigger image, we need to look at the one amongst our communities first and foremost and address those. And that doesn't mean we remain silent because we're not doing it. If we see it amongst our families, if we see it amongst our peers, we need to address that to say these issues that we are talking about on a macro level, they will not change until we effect the change at a micro level.
But you see that when we say that as Muslims, it's because there's a deeper understanding of how success is defined for us. And I think that's the significant difference, isn't it?
But you said the key thing there, how success is defined for us.
Yes, yeah.
We know what success looks like because we have a model of success in our faith, and we know how to transfer that model of success into our lives, be it social economic, be it social religious, be it social cultural, be anything. We have a complete deen, as we've been told in Surah Ma'idah. So what is being put upon us, we should have a spiritual armor that deflects that because of what we have within. So we shouldn't have a success model implemented upon us. Society does that, yes, but our faith, our religion penetrates through that and transcends any restrictions that any society places upon us. And we've witnessed that through the annals of history.
Yeah, and this, and again, I think what I was trying to say with this idea of success is that that's the roots that really embed within us, that we aren't losing anything by doing this.
No.
We're giving up something that is harmful, that is wrong, and that is hateful.
Yes.
And we are moving towards something which is uplifting, which is beneficial, and from the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is something that elevates us.
Yes.
And we,
good point. And we should ask ourselves this question. And I think we can go away with this. Let's look. What does it mean to be Pakistani? What does it mean to be Bangladeshi? What does it mean to be Jamaican? What does it mean to be Nigerian? What does it mean to be Ghanaian? What does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be British? And the last thing I will state here, and all of us should be able to answer this without hesitation, what does it mean to be Muslim?
Subhanallah. And I think, okay, we're gonna leave.
We can answer that.
Yeah, but do you want to go for it, bro? Answer it for us. What does it mean to be Muslim, Dr. Abdul Haqq?
What it means to be Muslim is exactly that. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. And to worship Allah in Tawheed, following his final messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, adhering to the Sunnah, knowing that through this way, adherence to the Quran and the Sunnah are the keys to success in this life and in the hereafter. That is what it means to be a Muslim. And if anyone wants to bring a succinct and more complete answer that encapsulates this life and the hereafter about what it means to be Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Jamaican, Nigerian, British, or whatever, please bring it forward. You will not be able to, because these are limited identity constructs for this life.
Yeah.
Being
and fluid, very fluid.
Yeah, very fluid, exactly.
Yeah.
And being a Muslim is for this life and the next.
Subhanallah. And if I can just use a quick example, I know that, for example, like when people go back to home, and I know when my parents used to travel back, the society changed, culture changed, but we keep these microcosms of cultures when we arrive as migrants, and we keep those cultures. And then when we go back with them, we think, whoa, what have you guys been doing? You've changed the culture. But again, similarly, it's like expats, they go away and then they come back and go, what's been going on? I said, well, what's been going on is Britishness has been going on. That's what's going on. We're kind of exploring that part of identity, and we're growing and progressing in these particular
and there's
ways.
There's nothing wrong with these cultures. I'm not saying to throw these identities out of the window,
yeah.
But what is conducive to our faith, we keep. Because the faith, our religion, enhances those aspects. But it also comes to change and remove, as I said, where that tree, where the roots are deep, to remove those weeds, to remove those things that are antithetical to Islam and to our character. So we can be Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Jamaican, Nigerian, British. We can be all of those things, but those characteristics, those cultural characteristics, must accord with Islam. Islam is the litmus test and the mirror that we must be reflecting in and off, not the other way around.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. All right. We're gonna kind of shift onto this, inshallah, next week. Inshallah, we'll definitely carry this on. For everybody, I just want to say Jazakallah khair for listening, tuning in. Like, share, and subscribe. This week's book of the week, Dr. Abdul Haqq.
I think, again, another pertinent book that I chose is even more relevant now. British Muslims, New Directions in Islamic Thought, Creativity and Activism by Philip Lewis and Sadiq Hamid. There we go.
All right, okay.
And the link should be put up there. Interesting book, very current. And for the younger Muslims, and even those who are not from the UK, to look at the movement and galvanization of the younger generations and their activism, which is being fueled by their faith and their identity, British identity, as well as the other aspects that they have with these binary sort of bonds.
Okay, inshallah. All right, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Again, thank you everybody who's been watching from across the world. Subhanallah. Jazakallah khair for your time this evening or this afternoon, wherever you are. The book of the week is up there in the collection. Like I said, like, share, and subscribe. Questions and thoughts, please put them in the comments box. We will look at them as well, inshallah, after this show is finished. And again, if you have any questions, you want to bring anything, like we said, we share, not just in the sense of sending this stuff out to everybody else, but share in the sense of let us know. And if we can bring it into this discussion, inshallah, we will definitely do our best to do so. Again, I just want to take time to thank our guest, Dr. Abdul Haqq, Jazakumullah khair, for being with us this evening. And from Newcastle Fast FM, Jazakallah khair for tuning in, everybody. And inshallah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, we will see you next Monday, 8 p.m. GMT +1 or BST time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.